Welcome to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. I'm your host, Dori Pham. Join me and my fellow public policy classmates as we explore potential policy solutions for today's most pressing societal challenges. Welcome to Policy Chats. Today we are joined by Shaka Mitchell, a senior fellow at the American Federation for Children, a lawyer and a national leader in education reform. You are based in Nashville and you bring experience across the school networks, civil rights advocacy, and constitutional law. You have also served as chair of the Tennessee State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and you have taught constitutional law at Belmont University, and you are also an Aspen Institute Civil Society Fellow. So thank you so much for joining us today. And so let's start off about a bit about your work. So your work spans on education reform, constitutional law, civil rights advocacy, and community engagement. Looking back, what initially drew you to education policy as a focal point, and how has your understanding of what effective and just reform looks like, and how has it evolved?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Andrew and Dori, I appreciate the time and the thoughtful questions that you sent over. So, taking your first question, what initially drew me to education policy as kind of a focus? Well, I think in some ways, it goes without saying that everyone has their own education journey, right? Because we were all at some point, at least in this context, in the U.S. context, we were all at some point students, and really most of the world. We all were students. Frankly, even if you never attended a formal school institution, you had to learn things, right? Your first teachers were your parents, perhaps, or other family members, even siblings. So we all have an educational journey. In my own case, I grew up in an area where the local zoned public schools were pretty low quality and unsafe schools. And so we found other options. My parents chose other options for me. So I think certainly there were some seeds planted at an early age. But by the time I got to college and then beyond in law school, I started to really think about education policy as a focus, in part because I view it as such a matter of first principles. I think that there are so many other, obviously very worthy causes and issues that we might take up. But if we have an uneducated populace, I don't really have any great hope that we're going to make a lot of headway on, say, other economic challenges or climate change challenges or criminal recidivism or healthcare, right? If you have an uneducated populace, then almost necessarily lots of other public policy issues that come downstream from that are going to be sort of hamstrung. So I think that education, I think if we get this right, or at least something approximating a more efficacious education system, I think we will get a lot of other issues resolved as well. In terms of how reform has kind of evolved, as I've moved between the communities, I think in some ways the thing that's been most instructive to how I think about education policy is having children of my own, right? Because when you have children of your own, you can also, it gets real and personal in a different way. And so you are almost necessarily not just commenting on a system, but you are often advocating on someone else's behalf. And so appreciating just the diversity of family and student needs, I think that's given me really good perspective as I go into these other arenas, whether it's advocacy or legal or, public policy arenas. I think staying proximal to the end user, which in my view is students and families, I think that helps inform the process.
Thank you, Shaka. That's a really fantastic answer. And I really particularly enjoyed how you mentioned that education is really the springboard into educating our youth, and how we solve, our pressing challenges right now. And just diving right into this, school choice and charter schools have become one of the most contested issues, in education policies. So, drawing on your experiences with high-performing charter networks in Nashville, how do you think the meaning of school choice has shifted over the past decade, particularly around national polarization, around race, equity, and public institutions has intensified?
Yeah, it's a great question, Andrew. I do think that that the understanding of school choice has changed. Even the verbiage, school choice, and what those words mean have changed. So, for instance, I mean, school choice is still, I would say, the most typical term that's used when we talk about using public dollars beyond publicly operated schools, right? Because when we're talking about school choice, really what we're talking about is making sure parents have access to a range of options that meet their kids' needs, but that are still publicly funded. So not just government operated schools. But I'll tell you, years ago, I remember having a conversation with the then Secretary of Education, Rod Page, who recently passed away. And Rod Page was, an African American, kind of came up through the civil rights era. And he told me that for many people of his generation, that school choice was kind of had a negative connotation because it reminded them of white flight, right? It was, school choice was the term that was back then in the late 60s, early 70s, used after desegregation. It was used when people would leave their public schools and say go to the suburbs and start a new school, or try to exit segregated schools, in recently integrated schools rather. And so it was kind of a dirty word. Then you see, I think the movement kind of reclaims the phrase so that school choice really means giving parents choice, right? And so I would say today, it's come much more to mean parent choice or educational choice. Sometimes you hear the phrase educational freedom get used a lot. And, in some ways, I don't care what you call it if you're giving families more options, but the words do matter. And I think today it is more accurate to think about educational choice, because many families now are using public dollars and their kids are not even attending a brick and mortar school, right? They might be doing hybrid learning. They might be doing things where they're at home 2 days a week and in a co-op with other kids, a micro school for 3 days a week. And so that's not school like we would have thought about a school building, even 20 years ago, let alone 50 years ago, right? So I think educational choice now is really the concept that's taken hold. And you see now more than 1.2, 1.3 million children around the country are participating in private choice programs. So it's definitely gained momentum.
Yeah, that's awesome, and thank you so much for the insight on how, like the quick brief history on school choices and how that term has now changed, but the concept has still stayed the same. Um, so you have served as chair of the Tennessee State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and during that time, you have engaged directly with civil rights law at the state level. How do you see civil rights frameworks shaping current education debates? And where do you think traditional civil rights approaches succeed or fall short in addressing modern educational inequities?
Yeah, that's another good question. And there's definitely an interplay between sort of concepts of civil rights and education, primarily because every state in the country includes education as a constitutional right, or a constitutional mandate, frankly, that the state government shall, in some cases, you call it establish a system of common schools, et cetera. But what it's really doing is it's memorializing the concept of some sort of publicly funded education system. And so now you've got this legally entrenched idea that an educated populace is something that we highly value. Okay, so you go from that concept to then asking the question, sort of the brass tacks question, well, how are children actually doing? And that's when we get into this space where we say, oh, maybe now we may have some civil rights issues. So many people don't realize, for instance, that it wasn't until the Americans with Disabilities Act and then later the Individual with Disabilities in Education Act, IDEA, it wasn't until those laws passed that students with disabilities even had a federally recognized right to attend public school in their own state, right? So that's a place where you say, oh boy, it's really important that we had laws passed that affirmed the fact that when we say all students should be able to attend school, we really mean all students, right? Irrespective of whether it's race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, or disability. So definitely there's a lot of interplay there. Now, where do I think that this framework can really fall short? I think let's go back to students with disabilities. I think that's exactly the place where it falls short, is because unfortunately, sometimes when we have laws, we get into a compliance mindset. And if you talk to parents who have been through the IDEA process, or the IEP process, it's usually called, and that is their children are at a public school and they need some different types of accommodations because of some sort of special needs that they have. You mostly hear negative things about that process, right? Because it's very, very compliance based. It's based on, is a student receiving this many minutes or hours of services? Do we have this many people on staff with the right certifications, et cetera? And it is less centered around the individual child's needs. So what you often see in the realm of special education is that things are legally compliant, but substantively not very valuable, right? Because you're trying to come up with a system that works for 15% of K-12 students, which is, I don't know, something like 7.5 million students. That's a lot of students. There's never going to be one system that works for all of those people. So that's where you see a limitation of the legal framework, even though it's well intended. It doesn't let families kind of break out of that mold. That's one of the things that has spurred me on in school choice, is because you are giving families the ability to say, you know what, if that's not working for you, you can take the funds and you can go do something else. It's not to denigrate the public school system per se, but it's to say, listen, all families need options, and let's be realistic about whether or not the same system can work for all students.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your answer. As a follow-up, you said in your answer before, you said that school choice, they usually the school policies, they don't include everyone, and so they especially students with disabilities. And so at the School of Public Policy, we have our motto, which is solutions for the region, solutions for the world. And so do you have any solutions for that issue that you just brought up?
Yeah. Well, and I love that motto as well. It's a reminder that things are often done a little bit better when they're proximal first, and then let's see if we can kind of extrapolate out and maybe scale up a workable solution. So there are many programs actually around the country that are specifically designed to give families who have students with special needs options beyond their locally zoned school. So in my state, Tennessee, we have a program that's called the IEA, Individualized Education Accounts Program. And if you have a student with one of any number of special needs, then what you can do, if your school, your public school, is not working for you, by whatever measure you think is important. Maybe that's academic. Many parents report that bullying is an issue. Many parents report that there's just not the services. The services are not being administered in a way that seems high quality or equitable. Whatever it is, if the school's not working for you, you can apply to this program, this IEA program. You can get the state share of funding that would have gone with you to that program, and you can take it with you. It's portable. And so then you can go to, say, a private school that specializes in working with students with, say, dyslexia or what have you. And if you think you can seek out a better education somewhere else, you can get the state resources that would have followed your child, and you can do it. So I think that, for instance, is a program that is yielding some really positive effects for the families who choose to use it. And again, it's all based on voluntary choice. So if it is an option if parents want to do it, it's not forced on any system that for parents who are satisfied with what they already have.
Yeah. So one more follow up.
Sure.
So you mentioned that program in Tennessee. It sounds like a really great program that I think Tennessee has been piloting. And so you said if the school is not suitable for a family, they are allowed to get the funds from that program and like opt out and choose another institution where their child can go to have education in. So my question is, and correct me if I'm wrong, I assume that money is given directly to the family. So how do we ensure that that funds allocated goes to the education of the child and not something else?
Yeah. So the funds are, I would say, directed by the parents. Usually the way that these programs work is that the money would go from the state agency, let's say the State Department of Education, and then goes into an account. And then from that account, so think of it almost as if I preloaded money into your account on Amazon. Well, you can't just withdraw that money at an ATM machine and get cash for it, right? You have to use it within that platform. So you can use it on things that have been predetermined or pre-selected to comport with the goal of the program. And so it's very similar in most states, so that a family might go into the portal where they have now this money in an account, and they say, okay, I want to choose school A, B, C, or D, right? And I can choose between schools, and then the parent directs the money. And so, it's a fine question, but you've got some checks that are in place to make sure that the funds are used in a manner that is responsible.
Thank you. And you make a lot of interesting points. And as a substitute teacher myself, I feel like I'm resonating with a lot of things and points that you're bringing, especially when you said that a lot of these laws, these systems, these policies are compliant on paper, but they're often not effective in practice. And I feel like I see that all the time in various schools, districts I work at, various schools at all grade levels. And so with that being said, I really want to focus on the part of your career where you worked and taught constitutional law, you served on law journals, advisory boards, and you even testified before a House subcommittee. And from that vantage point, can you please explain how legal institutions both enable and constrain educational reform, and what tensions arise when policy innovation moves faster than existing constitutional and statutory frameworks?
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, so let's talk about the constitutional pieces and sort of those legal elements in a minute. But if I can, Andrew, going back to what you said about some of your experiences as a substitute teacher, I think we can look all around us and see lots of instances where compliance doesn't necessarily constitute quality, right? And the one that I like to point to is driver's licenses. Most drivers, nearly all drivers, have a driver's license. It does not stop drivers from getting in car accidents, right? So that's a maybe it's clumsy, maybe it's clunky, but there's not a one-to-one sort of relationship with having or sort of checking that regulatory compliance box and being a great driver, right? Or being great at something. And the same is true in the education context. Okay, so in thinking about how legal institutions kind of coexist with education reform, a few things come to mind. There have been a string of education cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that are really, really important and instruct both activity at the federal level and at the state level. So I would say some of the most important cases that we have, there's a case known as Pierce and also Society of Sisters. And these are cases from the 20th century, early 20th century, that really stand for the principle that a child is not a creature of the state, right? That a child, first and foremost, is the responsibility of a parent. And so some of these cases came out, they erupted during the sort of first wave progressivism, where education was first starting to be compulsory. K-12 education was first starting to be compulsory. And oftentimes what would happen is you would have a city or a state say, well, if we see children, they must be in a public school. And there were some really important cases where the Supreme Court said, no, that's actually not true. If the state government or local government for federal government doesn't get to tell a parent, to force a parent to educate their child in a certain manner, right, and at a certain place. And that's a really important, like, fundamental bedrock principle. We have seen many cases at the U.S. Supreme Court level in recent years that stand for the principle that parents have the right to direct their child, to further direct their education, even with public dollars. And so there's been a string of cases that have involved oftentimes the First Amendment, because parents have wanted to say, well, I'd like to take the funds that are associated with my students' learning, and I'd like to send them to a religious school. And in some cases, states have tried to block that activity. So that happened in Montana, in a case called Espinosa. It happened in Maine in a case called Carson v. Macon, where in various ways you had state agencies say, well, you can't use that money if you want to use it at a religious institution or for religious instruction. And most recently, the Supreme Court has struck those down and said, has struck down that idea and has said, no, that's not true. That would be a form of religious discrimination, right? Where if you have a program that's accessible to all parents, you're not allowed to condition it on saying you can use this money, but only if you don't use it for, at a religious school. That would be religious discrimination. So that's an instance of the courts and the education institution sort of converging. I'll give you one more example, if that's all right. So now you see a lot of these legal battles in state courts. So from where we sit, sort of end of February, just 2 weeks ago, there was a Supreme Court case out of the state of Idaho. So the Idaho Supreme Court had a unanimous decision upholding its school choice program. It's a new school choice program. Because in that case, the plaintiffs who were challenging the law, they wanted to say that the state's duty to create a system of common schools, that represented a ceiling instead of a floor. So what the plaintiffs wanted to say was, well, the Constitution says we've got to have a system of public schools. And once we have a system of public schools, we think that's all you should be able to do. And the court said, absolutely not. That language is meant to be a floor. It's not meant to be a ceiling. So yes, you must have a system of public schools. General Assembly, you've got to fund that. You've got to provide for its maintenance and upkeep. But that's a floor. If you want to do something above and beyond that, you're able to do that, right? So it would be a little bit like if I said if I said to Dori, you need to make sure you provide Andrew with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And you said, okay, great. And you provide him with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You've got that ready. You've got your meals planned. And then about 3 p.m., you decide to give him a snack. And I say, no. I said, you have to provide him breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You can't give snacks. Well, that's crazy, because obviously you've met your requirement, your duty, and then you're doing something extra, right? We're not going to penalize you for doing something extra. And that's what the plaintiffs in Idaho were trying to convince the court of. They rejected that. There's a similar case in Wyoming right now. And I'm hopeful that the Wyoming Supreme Court will reach the same decision and will sort of uphold the ability of the legislature to go above and beyond what the Constitution says is required.
Social injustice, health disparities, and climate change. Are you interested in pressing challenges like these facing our region and world? Make your impact by joining the next cohort of the UCR Master of Public Policy program. Learn more at mpp.ucr.edu.
And as a follow-up to this, and because this is one of my favorite topics within public policy, is the court system and the Supreme Court in particular. And most people have, earnest and, honest feelings both ways, whether, how the Supreme Court votes. And what comes to mind to me is that how much power should unelected, justices, only 9 of them, have in actually shaping and affecting the American public school system? Because it seems like that, they have a lot of power, and sometimes in great ways, sometimes in not so great ways. Like I can name probably a couple off the top of my head, like Brown v. Board, ending segregation in schools.
Right.
I believe there was another important one that gave undocumented children here the right to have an education as well.
Yeah, Plyler v. Doe. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you touch on that maybe a little bit more?
Yeah. This is a good question. I mean, certainly the U.S. Supreme Court is really tasked with making decisions about the interpretation of laws as weighed against the federal Constitution. And I would say in those cases, and in the cases that I described, whether it's Pierce v. Society of Sisters, Carson v. Macon, these, the more modern cases, that's what the court's doing. The court is really saying someone came to us with a First Amendment challenge, with an equal protection challenge out of the 14th Amendment, whatever it is, and they want us to interpret it. I think we certainly should be wary of a system where we had a bunch of philosopher kings. That's not the system that we asked for. It's not the system that the framers created. But I don't think that's the system that we have, right? The U.S. Supreme Court justices don't get to just look around the country and pick an issue and rule on it just because they feel like it, right? Someone asks them to do it. Usually by the time it gets to them, it has wound its way through any number of other courts, whether at the state level or through, the district court process. So by the time a case gets to the Supremes, you've got a case or controversy that I think warrants some thoughtful jurisprudence. So by and large, I think the court does a pretty good job. There's always going to be cases that you disagree with, or cases that you would have written differently. But by and large, I think it does a good job. And to your point, often what it does, and you saw this in Brown versus Board of Education, that decision comes out, in 54? And that doesn't mean that schools integrated right away. Because again, what is the court doing? The court is interpreting laws, but it doesn't have the power to execute and enforce them. And so they had to come back again, months later and say, no, really, states, we were serious about that. You need to move with, kind of all due haste, and you need to move deliberately towards integration. It would take some states another 15 years before they finally desegregated. And so I would say that's not a court issue, right? That is sometimes these recalcitrant local and state governments. But on balance, I think we are probably better for having a slower, more prudent process than not. Not in the case of desegregation. I think we should have moved faster, I should say. But generally speaking, I don't think you want the court to have that kind of quick enforcement power. You want things to go through the right channels and have separation of powers.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your insight. And as a follow-up to your answer and your thoughts on how courts should have separation of power and how education policy is, it takes a really long time to like implement them, test them, verify, and see the actual effects. What is one way that we can streamline that process, or is the current process perfect?
Well, it's a good question. How do you streamline the process? One way to do it, honestly, would be to, and I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to keep that hat on for a little while longer. One way to do it would be to start awarding legal fees and attorney's costs when people file lawsuits that are basically frivolous. That case that I mentioned in the state of Idaho, is a 5-0 ruling. Now, maybe the plaintiffs thought that they had a realistic chance of winning, of convincing the justices. I would say, respectfully, that upon reading that brief when it was first filed, that most people who have practiced in that area read that brief and thought, this needs to go right in the waste paper basket because it doesn't have a chance. The arguments are specious at best. But we live in a system where it doesn't really cost you much to file a lawsuit, right? It doesn't cost much to file a lawsuit. Unfortunately, though, what happens in many cases, and it's happening right now in Wyoming, is a lawsuit gets filed and a court issues a quick injunction or restraining order. And so it holds up a process, right? So you've got a system in Wyoming right now where there are thousands of kids who should be receiving scholarships to do whatever, to choose the school of their choice, but they can't because somebody filed a lawsuit, somebody who doesn't even have, kids in the system maybe. I would say that's near frivolous. Now, if they had to pay the attorney's fees, or if they knew that they were going to have to pay the attorney's fees if they lost that case, I think it would change how, I think it would change how the decision that people make when they file lawsuits like that. And that would help these policies go into practice faster.
Well, thank you so much for that solution where you basically nudge or force people to think twice before filing a lawsuit that affects others. So we've been talking about federal policies, federal education policies, federal laws for a while. So I would like to move that conversation to a more local perspective. Since education policy is often decided locally, but national political narratives has increasingly shaped how communities interpret those decisions. From your work and experience in Nashville and beyond, how do national debates filter into local education governance? And what does that mean for the ability of cities and states to pursue a pragmatic, community-centered solutions?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Dori, to note that in education, as in many areas of public policy, the national conversation or national narrative shapes what happens even at the local, in hyper local level. And I'll give you an example of where I see that playing itself out right now. Last summer of 2025, Congress passed the One Big Bill, right? And this was, I don't know, I think 1,300 pages, which means there's a lot of things in there. It probably also means that very few people read the whole thing. And I will not act like I read the whole thing. I read about 2 pages of it, the 2 relevant pages to what I do. But those 2 relevant pages deal with what's now called the Education Freedom Tax Credit. It allows scholarships to be given, and the money for the scholarships comes from a tax credit. So it's not government money. It means that instead of me, paying, if I have tax liability, federal tax liability, instead of me writing a check to the U.S. Treasury, I can direct a small portion, $1,700, to a scholarship fund. Okay, great. That, if I just describe it like that, that's not really a partisan thing. It shouldn't be a partisan matter. Kids who receive scholarships don't care where the tax money came from, right? The schools that they attend, they don't ask what political party did your student receive a scholarship from, because it doesn't work like that. It's just nonsensical. This should be bipartisan. This should be a no-brainer. Unfortunately, though, because things are so hyper-partisan, there has been this sort of reflexive reaction among many governors to not participate because this passed as part of the One Big Bill, which was, of course, Republican President Trump's signature initiative. And so just for the simple fact that he named, gave it the name of the One Big Beautiful Bill, you've got lots of Democratic governors who don't want to let their states participate in the scholarship program. And I would say that's a really unconstructive way to think about this, because they are limiting now the ability of, in some cases, millions of children in their state to have access to scholarship money, because this money, by the way, can be used by private, public, charter school, and homeschool students. Almost all students. But many governors are considering limiting the ability of their states to participate simply because, or I think it's simply because, this was passed by a Republican majority in Congress. So that's a place where the national narrative is not helpful. Now, there have been some governors, and so hats off to Governor Paulus in Colorado. He's a Democrat, and he has said, you know what, we're going to participate in this program because guess what? You get taxed regardless of whether or not you're a Republican or a Democrat, which means who cares? Let's put the money into scholarships regardless of whether or not, you're Republican or Democrat and who passed the law, because this can benefit students. And that, I think, is the right mindset to have, especially when we think about education. Is this student-centric, irrespective of partisanship?
Thank you so much for that answer and that great example on how politics affect education policies. And I do have one follow-up for you, which is sometimes the money that are really allocated from tax money can be misallocated, and this money will potentially not go to a student that needs it and that can receive it. And so I would imagine, a governor saying that it's better to have that money be directed to tax money and then later reallocate to the education reforms and policies. What do you think of that perspective and idea?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting perspective, but in this case, that's actually not the binary choice that's on the table, because this money, the origin of this money is coming from individual taxpayers, right? The option is either I put my money into the scholarship fund or I pay it to Treasury. There really is no option. I already pay money into the public school, tax coffers, right? Because that's where property taxes go. So there's not really the option to put it into, to direct it to the, I'm not even sure who you would direct it to because it's a federal program. So there's not really the option to direct it to the U.S. Department of Education or to the state Department of Education. So I understand the concept, but that's not really the choice that's on the table, if that makes sense.
Well, I really appreciate your insight. And I think so far we've done a great job really dissecting both the political and educational machine and why our educational system is failing the marginalized communities, and also where its effectiveness is not quite landing. But I want to focus our last segment or a couple of questions on, so more of a solutions and maybe the path forward into solving these problems. So through the Aspen Institute Civil Society Fellowship and initiatives like Come Together Music Project, you emphasize dialogue across ideological and social divides. Why is education policy such or serving as bridges, for said divides? And what have you learned about building trust and shared purpose in a highly polarized environment?
Yeah. Education, I think, is very, very personal, right? It's personal because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, we all have our own personal education story. And then once you become a parent, it's personal because your kids are going through it, right? And I think that there is a very challenging psychology at play when you think about how you talk to parents about education. In some ways, all parents have to be able to psychologically justify the position that their child is in, because it would be untenable to go through the day as a parent thinking that you had failed your own child, right? Thinking that you had done something that makes them necessarily worse off, right? So even in the face of seeing statistics, and I've seen this before when I've presented statistics to people, you present statistics to people that says, hey, present data to people that says, your school, the school that your child attends, is one of the lowest performing schools in the state. And what that might mean, by the way, is that less than 5% of the kids can read on grade level, less than 5%. I've been in these schools. And you present parents with this data, no parent believes that their child is part of that 5%, right? But we know that it has to be true. Somebody's got to be there. And so that's a really challenging thing to overcome in terms of discourse and dialogue, because I think what you want to do, what I have learned, is that you're trying to get families to come along and say, listen, we have got to reform the situation. And at the same time, you're not trying to shame people and make them feel as if they've done something wrong to the detriment of their children. And so that's where I have learned, I hope, to kind of tone down my language even. I think this is where you see a lot of friction between the education choice community and teachers unions. I think those two institutions, if you will, or kind of sects, are often at loggerheads, except that, of course, teachers believe in choice. Imagine if teachers were assigned to teach at a school based on where they lived. Well, nobody would do it, right? Or only a select few. There would be lots of schools that just go vacant because they don't have teachers. So, of course, they believe in having options. So I think it is often a matter of language. Are we using language that invites us to come together and work on policy solutions together as advocates, parents, and teachers, getting us all in the room? Or do we believe that these things have to be zero sum? And I don't think that education reform and education choice has to be a zero sum game. I think we can have high quality government operated schools, but I think those are most likely to exist in an ecosystem where we have a range of other options. And then the competition is going to make us all better.
Yeah, thank you. Just out of curiosity, so basically, school choice is basically restricting a student um, to a school that is in their area. And so, one question that I had is, once you get rid of this barrier and students can basically choose whatever school they want to go to, how do you ensure that? How do you ensure a balance of students in a school? So basically, what I mean is, for example, there'll be like one preferred school, and let's say it's school A, and it's like the best school in the region, and of course, every single parents wants what's best for their children, so they would try to get their children to go there, and the school A will have a overload amount of students enrolling, and like let's say some other school which is closer to their house or in their region that is not as prestigious as school A, let's say it's school B, and they have dropping numbers of enrollment and they have vacant number of slots of students. So how do we ensure the equity and equality between that?
Yeah. So, I mean, that system that you describe is effectively what we have in many school districts, right? Where there's one preferred, let's say high schools, let's keep it to high schools, where there's one preferred high school and everybody wants to try to go there. And then all of the other high schools are, just maybe okay. They're average, maybe a little below average, whatever. That's the situation in many places. In a system where there's no school choice, then the reason that all of the other sort of school Bs, if you will, the reason that all of those B schools have students is because those students have nowhere else to go. They have to go there, right? So it's a compulsory thing. So they go there, and those schools don't really have to respond the way they would in a marketplace. If you had choice, and now parents can really go wherever they want, one of the things that I believe will happen is that all of those those B schools that are at risk of having their enrollment decrease, which means they're at risk of having their revenue decrease, now all of a sudden they're going to have to say, hey, what is school A doing? What are they doing and what are they getting right that we should be doing, right? And then you start to see some change in the programs. You start to see some responsiveness to what families and students actually are looking for that reforms the system. Yeah.
I have a follow-up based off that question, and it's that, can we have like the best of both worlds? Like, can we expand school choice without weakening the public school system? Because I feel like the argument, well, at least when I have it, what people hear about it, they act like it's mutually exclusive. Like, you can only do one or the other.
Right.
But like, can you really do both or no?
I think you can do both. And I think, Florida tends to be a pretty good example of this because Florida's got, out of about 3 million school-age students, Florida has almost 1 million of those students in schools of choice. Okay. Which is pretty remarkable. That outside of the Washington, D.C., if you consider that a state, but it's kind of this weird hybrid, that's the highest percentage, highest ratio in the country. And what you see in Florida is you actually don't see many public schools that eventually close and sort of go out of business, so to speak. Instead, what they do is they reconstitute, they shift their programming a little bit, right? Because one of the things that happens, Andrew, is that when you have a system of school choice, it doesn't happen overnight, and schools don't get built overnight, right? So for better or worse, this has to change. Things change over time. And so you might pass a law. If a law that gets passed today in 2026 and goes into effect later this year, well, it's not like all of a sudden by this fall we will have built 100,000 new private schools and that's where all the kids are going to go. And right, it just takes time. And so that process is a little bit like, kind of water leveling out over. It doesn't matter if the seabed is uneven, it's all going to level out, and that process takes time. And so I do think you can have both. I think you see schools improve and you see an increase of choice. Florida has showed that. Ohio's another good example of that, where the kids did really well, and kids who were exposed to more competition also did, but stayed in public school, also did better. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. And so I wanted for us to let's step back a bit from, you have so many roles. So as a lawyer, educator, policy advocate, and a parent, what do you think about your work that reviews about the future of education reform in a polarized democracy? And how should policymakers and advocates think about advancing effectiveness and justice simultaneously? And what gives you hope that public institutions can still rise to meet that challenge?
Well, when I think about the various roles that or sort of hats I wear, seats that I sit in, what have you, I think that we've got to appreciate that no one has a single story. If I can borrow a phrase from another author, meaning that if you know that I'm an education choice advocate, all you know is that I'm an education choice advocate. You don't know that I'm the father of 3 children. You don't know that those 3 children are girls. You don't know what ages they are. You don't know the experiences, right? And so I think we've got to be very careful not to be so reductive that we look at someone or interact with someone one time and we assume that we know everything about their stated position and their life and their perspective, but rather that we take the time to ask, what is the perspective that this person's bringing? Are they, because all of those varied lenses can be instructive. And so when I think about how we sort of depolarize, I think that's part of it. I think part of it is just listening to one another and not trying to reduce one another and minimize people's sort of experience into just like a top line talking point. It turns out everyone is more nuanced than a conversation on X. And so we need to be willing to have those conversations, but it takes time and it takes patience. And I think the more that policymakers and advocates will take time to do that, the better our policies will be. And then the last thing I would say about how our institutions can sort of meet the challenges that still lay before us. I really think if you're an advocate or a policymaker, staying proximal to the work is important. So I know many people that haven't set foot in a school in years, decades. I think that's pretty harmful if you're going to be making decisions about schools, right? If you are someone who is a champion of public schools or not, I think you need to go visit some, and I think you need to go visit some other schools too. Go visit some micro schools and see these new learning models. I mean, even in, I don't think of myself as an old man, but I'm older, certainly older than you guys. In the time between, when I was in school and now, so much has changed. And so if I was just making decisions based off of what school looked like back then, well, then I'd still be standing in my kitchen. We wouldn't be doing this. We'd be standing in our kitchens, holding the phone to our head with a cord that came out of the wall, right? A whole lot has changed in the time since then. And so I think to be able to weave that into our policymaking and decisions, we need to go and get close to the work. And so staying proximal, I think, helps us meet those challenges.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your insightful answer. And to basically summarize what you said, um, I think I do agree with you on how policymakers should have a open-minded and should be well versed in their area of policies, and that could really help, their decision, their policy making, and how that policy affects everyone. And it's a crucial part of the policy making process. So kind of like the last question, and we ask our guests this every single time.
Sure.
If you had a magical wand that can fix basically anything, but just one issue, what would that be and why?
Well, you know what I'm going to pick. I'm going to pick education, and why? And by fix, I would have dollars follow or resources. I would have resources follow students to the setting that best meets their needs. And the why is because I really think that every person deserves to learn in a way that will help them access their fullest potential. And I really believe that education allows us to do that. It's the closest thing that we have to a surefire way to, climb up the socio or the economic ladder. It's the surest way we have to attain the American dream. I think it all starts with education.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So I think that wraps up our conversation today. Thank you so much for being on the Policy Chats podcast. Today we talked a lot of things, especially school choices and how education impact the lives of Americans. So thank you so much for coming on the Policy Chats podcast, and we are so glad you have spent the last hour with us talking about these issues and providing solutions. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you for listening to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us on Instagram at UCR_SPP. To learn more about our program and upcoming episodes, visit spp.ucr.edu. For the video version of this episode, check out our YouTube channel at UCR School of Public Policy. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.